Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Department of Psychiatry Grand Rounds. Today we have a presentation by Dr. Duncan, and as well as Ms. Olive, who will be presenting human subject research and overview of associated definitions, regulations, and ethics. Dr. Duncan is the Vice Provost for Research and Sponsored Programs and Chief of Research here at ETSU, and in that capacity he provides leadership for all research programs and is the primary advocate for the university's research mission. Dr. Duncan completed his undergraduate training at UT Austin. I've told him we won't hold that against him. Ph.D. at the UT Health Science Center in Dallas. He's been at ETSU since 2008. Prior to that, he was the Chief Operating and Scientific Officer at Baylor Research Institute in Dallas. He served as the Associate and Deputy Director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease at the NIH. Prior to that, he served as the Director of Research Programs at the National Cancer Institute of Canada. He has more than 50 publications in large part areas of allergy and immunology. With him today is Ms. Janine Olive, the Director of Human Subjects Research Protection Program at ETSU. Responsibilities including ensuring records and procedures of all IRBs, making sure federal requirements are met pertaining to human subjects, and in doing so, ensuring accreditation by the Association for the Accreditation of Human Research Protection Programs. She completed her education at ETSU College of Nursing and holds a BSN in nursing, completed her graduate coursework at ETSU College of Public Health. Past positions include Clinical Research Associate at the College of Medicine, Division of Cardiology, where she ensured maintaining appropriate guidelines for research both at JCMC and the VA. And we are very happy to have them here today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful introduction. Thank you for inviting us today to discuss with you the issues related to involvement of human subjects in research. And it's an interesting subject. I began as a researcher, studying basic science and animal models. And then when I moved to the NIH in 1987, and I was affiliated with organ transplant programs in my research, but when I moved to the NIH in 1987 and began working with organ transplant studies at the national level, and then also working at with HIV/AIDS development of new drugs. Human subject research was at the forefront of my thinking and what we could do. And what we'd like to talk today is how did we get where we are today in terms of the evolution of ethics, the evolution of how you treat human subjects, and from the evolution of the ethical concerns, the evolution of regulatory concerns and definitions and guidelines that we all live under today. And so that's really going to sort of be the topic we will be focusing on. Okay. Here we are. We have no conflicts to talk about today. We won't be talking about any drugs that are used outside. I thought before we begin today, we could start with a case study to sort of give you a sense of what you might run into if you're a clinician. And this is a case where Mrs. Franklin is an 81-year-old Alzheimer's patient who's hospitalized under your care and has been asked to participate in a clinical trial testing a new drug designed to help improve memory. You were present when the clinical investigator who's going to be carrying out the study obtained signed informed consent form from Mrs. Franklin a few days ago. However, when you visit Mrs. Franklin today and ask her, is she really ready to begin this study tomorrow? And she looks at you blankly and seems to have no idea what you're talking about. What should you do? This is the kind of thing you'd run into in your clinical component. And so I think this sort of gives you a sense of some of the issues you're going to face, and hopefully by the end of our discussion today, you'll be able to have a good idea of how you respond to this situation. and what's the most appropriate thing to do. Okay, today this is the overview we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about the ethical guidelines that were developed. I think one thing to drive home is that the field of ethics and human subject research is really not that old. The real basis for it was in 1949 with the Nuremberg Code, so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the Declaration of Helsinki. These are some of the terms, if you're involved in clinical research, you're going to understand. We're going to talk about the Tuskegee study, which had a huge impact upon the guidelines and regulations in the United States. We're going to talk about the Belmont Report, which came out of the Tuskegee study investigations. And we're going to talk about the Common Rule, which is really implementation of the recommendations from the Belmont Report into federal regulations, which are federal law that we operate under in overseeing human subject research, especially human subject research that's sponsored by the federal government and or carried out by the federal government. And then we'll end with a discussion of the definitions of really what is human subject research. Talk about FDA's definition for that. It's actually a little bit different from the Department of Human Health Service. And then we're going to go through some case studies with the clickers, anonymous responses, to give you a sense of how you, after you've listened to what we've talked about, how you might address some of these issues as they develop. Now, ethical codes and standards and regulations guide all forms of professional practice, especially in terms of clinical medicine. In terms of research, clinical research, they're usually developed in response to scandal and impropriety. And as I teach ethics to the graduate students, I say, the sins of a few lead to the pain of the many that we're all operating under. So much of the regulations we have were not put into place because ethicists and physicians sat in a room and said, "Oh, we think we need to do this." They were in response to horrible things that occurred, and in response to trying to prevent that. And I think also what is kind of surprising when I begin to read in this area and prepare lectures is that history of research ethics really paints a pretty bleak picture of the treatment of research subjects at the hands of researchers. And so keep that in mind as we move through our discussions today. There are several pillars that really govern and hold up the ethical conduct of human subject research, and those really begin, as we talk about throughout the talk today, obtaining appropriate consent of the individual to participate in the study and to be able to lead the study at their will. Should be peer reviewed. The study should be appropriate and should have sound scientific basis and deliver results that might have an impact upon the practice of medicine. It should rely on the research integrity of the investigators and the staff all involved in carrying out the study. And it should be as free of conflict of interest for potential financial gain as possible. So we're going to be talking now, so how do we get to where we are today in 2015? And the types of ethical codes and regulations we're going to go over, the Nuremberg Code, as I mentioned, was established not that long ago in 1949, post-World War II. The Declaration of Helsinki, the World Health Organization discussions in 1964 through 2000. And the Belmont Report in response to the Tuskegee study in 1979, really not that long ago. And finally, the implementation of the Common Rule into federal regulations which guide the use of protection of human subjects if you're using and taking federal money. And that didn't really occur until 1991. It's very interesting. I guess in 2013, ethicists said we really need to go back and look at the Common Rule and maybe revise some of the approaches and ethical guidelines. That's sort of stuck in limbo right now. There's a lot of debate going on between various communities, in ethical and clinical communities, and I'm not sure where that's going to go, but it's still under review. And I think that's an important thing to mention to you. Ethics really aren't set in stone. They evolve through societies. And we're going to be talking about the ethical concerns we have in our country. I've done research throughout the world, and you have to be cognizant of the research ethics and how they define ethics and how they define the treatment of individuals, how they obtain informed consent in each country. So it's, we can't, We can't say what we have is the pillar of the world. It may be, but when you're working in other countries, you also have to understand what the local issues are and the national issues are with regard to how they view ethical guidelines in a sense. I think when you look at it, really the beginning of the history of ethical considerations of involving humans in subject research began after World War II, when the atrocities were found in the concentration camps, in the prisoner of war camps, both in Germany and in Japan. That sort of raised tremendous eyebrows and concern. The number of studies conducted in the World War II German experience were vast. There were 26 areas of research conducted on humans without their consent. Decompression studies, hypothermia, sterilization, euthanasia agents, recovery from wounds and burns inflicted on individuals, starvation, and infectious diseases such as typhus and typhoid. So these were enormous number of studies conducted by physicians on human subjects. Janine's going to read some comments from individuals that were in concentration camps.
3 times a week, we were marched to Auschwitz to a big brick building, sort of like a big gymnasium. They would keep us there for about 6 or 8 hours at a time, most of the day. We were never informed about what they were doing. They just did it to us. Nobody ever said what we were given, what kind of shot, for what reason we were getting. Maybe some of the older twins were able to find out somehow, but whatever we knew from rumor was all we knew. In early June, about a month after I arrived, we were taken to the lab. As usual, we were not informed about what they were doing to us. On that day, I must have been injected with a germ of some sort. Even today, none of us really knows what was done to us.
Essentially, one of the major principles underlying ethical conduct of human research that came out of the Nuremberg evaluations was the principle of autonomy. That is, if you're going to participate in research, it must be voluntary and it must be through informed consent.
Most of the time, we were put on a table. Our arms were tied down, and they would begin. They would take blood from one arm, and they gave us shots in the other. I tried to ignore the pain, but it was hard, because sometimes they inserted another needle before withdrawing the first. Besides, they were not even trying to be gentle. After all, weren't we just guinea pigs? Within a short time after receiving the injection, I began to feel very ill. I tried very, very hard to hide the fact that I was ill because I did not want to be taken to the infirmary. It was a known fact that anybody that was taken to the infirmary never came back from there. I knew that on at least 2 occasions, one twin had become very ill, was taken to the infirmary, and never returned. Then the other twin was killed. I did not want this to happen to Marion. They gave me no water, no food, no medicine, no care. Of those 2 weeks, I remember little. In one book, I have read about how the prisoners were given some medications if they were available. I was never given any medicines, nor did I even see any medications.
This demonstrates a second principle. Beneficence should be good science and a favorable benefit ratio to the subject.
We were a control group, not children, just part of his experiments, unique only because of the duality of our births. When they chose me for the germ injection, they knew very well from the psychological observations. They had to know me very well from the observations they've been making all this time. I am sure the character profiles on me had shown me to be the stronger twin. My sister Miriam had been the weaker one all along and had been easier to work with all along. They chose me, I believe, because I was the strong one. I believe they felt she would not be as good a subject as I would. If I had died, they would have killed Miriam.
And this is the last principle, the principle of justice, equal opportunity to participate and to not to participate in a research study by any population or group of individuals. Here is a picture of the individuals coming out of Auschwitz in 1945. Janine has another reading.
I remember walking between the barbed wire and thinking, why do they want to take pictures of us? Are we movie stars or something? But the pictures taken that day have proved to be historic. My twin sister and I were among the first twins to leave. Life was to go on, but the echoes from Auschwitz would haunt me and influence me for the rest of my life. The two twins are in the front row. The author of those quotes, Miriam, Eva Moses Core, is beside the lady carrying a baby, and her twin sister Miriam is beside her.
Thank you. So in response to the Nuremberg discussions, the Nuremberg Code was developed and sort of became the first basis of ethical conduct, guiding ethical conduct of subject research. And that include informed consent, as you've heard from these individuals, that was something that was totally lacking. That the benefit must outweigh the risk to the subject. And that's something that's always important as we think about human subject research. That experimentation has to be voluntary, no coercion of force. And I think you have to realize that these guidelines were developed in response to studies being conducted on individuals, prisoners, whether they be in a concentration camp or in a prisoner of war camp. So they primarily focused on research involving prisoners who had no option because they could not leave the situation. I think what's important is there was no consideration of research on the mentally ill or those cognitively impaired, which I think is a crucial concern as we're going to develop as we move through and discuss the development and evolving nature of ethical conduct of research. I think it's important to realize that as those codes were developed and started to move throughout the clinical community, they seemed to be embraced pretty readily in Europe, which obviously was the communities that were heavily impacted by the research that was going on and the atrocities that happened. Did not necessarily cross the Atlantic with great speed. It was important to realize that codes existed for delivery of health care, but not necessarily research from many of the medical communities that were involved in research. The Declaration of Helsinki identified research involving human subjects, as well as, and this is the first time I can find it that comes into the literature, the first time that research on material that's identifiable from human subjects, be that material be samples or identifiable data. And interest to the well-being of the subject must far outweigh the benefit to the society. That debate that goes on, is the research that important that we need to carry it out because it's going to benefit society? That's a continual debate among the ethicists and the individuals involved in these areas. This was the first time special populations were identified. They said it's important to realize economically and medically disadvantaged had to be protected. Those unable to give consent. Those are individuals who might be mentally ill or might have some kind of cognitive impairment. So that has begun to come into the codes that were developed. Those that may be subject to giving consent under duress, just been told they have cancer, here I've got this study, do you want to participate? That's a form of duress and mental stress. Those who will not be able to benefit from research should not be involved. And that's a classic example of helicopter research going into a country, doing medical research, and knowing that if that drug or that intervention proves to be positive, that the individuals in that country would never be able to afford to be able to have access to that health care. That was an important part after the fall of the Berlin Wall and many of the studies when we began to study HIV/AIDS drug testing in Africa. That was a big ethical concern for us. And then where research is combined with medical care, what is that fine line between the physician having the primary care of the individual as their responsibility and then having being involved in research? And those are fine lines that have to be looked at closely from all involved in the area. Okay, there were some limitations to the Helsinki Accords. They started in '64 and kept the World Health Organization continued to evolve and revise those into the year 2000. Basically, they were ignored in the U.S. and problems still existed. So again, the slow boat back from Europe to the U.S. With these ethical guidelines and concerns was continuing to be slow. Paper was published in 1966 by Beecher. He identified 22 cases of research that involved recently published studies that involved patently unethical practices in the use of human subject research. These were published papers in the mid-60s. They involved use of mentally ill patients for a study of diseases that were unrelated to the mental illness. They were the government-sponsored studies, and put that again, keep that in the back of your mind as we move to the next area. The Cold War studies and the CIA studies that we're all aware of during the Vietnam era and all the other issues. So there were things going on in this country, and I think it's important to realize that many times we think the atrocities that were conducted during the war, that was somebody else's problem. That was a foreign government's problem. But that was going on here. And as we talk about other studies, we were not that holy. And despite the existence of codes of research, researchers weren't adopting them. There was a slow process of adopting them into the research plans. And there were calls for reform for research. Again, this is mid-60s. Okay, and then in the backdrop of all of this, when the Helsinki discussions were going on, when the discussions were happening post-World War II in the investigation and the atrocities that after the war, the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis was going on in 1932 to 1972. How many of you are aware of the Tuskegee experiments? How many of you are aware of the Guatemalan experiments, the most recent ones? So these, I'm not going to talk about that, but haven't moved that into my lecture series, but that's another instance. But this is probably the hallmark, and the reason I talk about the Tuskegee study is I think that had the biggest impact upon this country and impact upon the government in putting the regulations that we all live under right now. So I want to go through that a little bit. It began in 1932. It was conducted by U.S. Department of Health Services, forerunner of the National Institutes of Health. It was undertaken with good motives in the context of racism. Remember, in the 30s, there was blatant racism still ongoing, and especially in the South. It was an observational study of over 400 African American males in Alabama with known syphilis. So at the end of the study, they had to have positive syphilis. There were many ethical concerns here. Available treatments in 1932 weren't great, but they were not given to the individuals. This was an epidemiological study. You had to have syphilis. We're going to enter into the study, and we're going to follow you till you die. Essentially, we're going to see what the progression of syphilis is in individuals. Treatments were withheld, especially when approved therapy became available in the 40s, when antibiotics that had an impact upon the organism causing syphilis. They controlled subjects' access to penicillin, deception, and they prevented enlistment of these individuals in the Army, because if they entered the Army, they'd been treated. If they were syphilis positive, they'd been treated. I think this puts a face on, you can look at, read articles, but when you look at this, these are the individuals. These are living human beings that were participating in human subjects research without their consent, and were being deceived and treatments withheld. I think what's important is that there were individuals involved, such as this nurse here, Eunice Rivers, who cared very deeply for the individuals. Here she is working with an individual in the cotton field, interacting with them, but still withholding information. You're in a study where we are withholding treatment for you. So there was opportunity to provide consent all the way through. Here's a physician drawing blood samples from a subject in the study. And again, many opportunities to let these individuals know they're participating in this study and the treatment's available and we're not giving it to you. This broke in 72 when a physician who was involved with the study said, this is horrible, can't go forward. And it really had a huge impact. Here's a cartoon in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and there's the patient who's just passed away, and the nurse says, ignore this, the sign says, ignore this patient, experiment in progress, and the nurse says, now we can give him penicillin. This really shocked, I think, the country and the population, especially Congress, in the sense as, you know, somebody else doing something wrong after the war. We were doing it at the same time. We just kind of didn't tell anyone. So the response to Tuskegee, when you have a problem, you appoint a committee. So the Tuskegee Advisory Panel was appointed in 73. They recommended termination of the study. That's a no-brainer. They determined the government's policies for reviewing scientific procedures and consent policies in federally funded research were inadequate. They recommended requiring establishment of an institutional review board for review of all federally funded human subject studies. Federal Advisory Board was then set up. It met from 74 to 78, the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavioral Research. And that led to one of the most important documents in our country's history with regarding human subject research, the Belmont Report. And they established 3 ethical principles central to a research enterprise, and you've seen them before. It parallels what was seen with the other codes we've talked about. Principle of respect for individuals, individual autonomy. Individuals have the right to participate in a study, and they have the right to stop participation at any given time. Protection of the individual with reduced autonomy. This is really important. If an individual cannot give appropriate consent, this being a child, this being an individual who may have mental illness or may have cognitively impaired, you know, there needs to be protection built in to ensure their participation in any research study is appropriate and ethical. Again, the principle of beneficence. This requires that the risk-benefit assessment be made. Any particular study is going to have some risk. Now, what are the risks? What is the potential benefit for the subject? And the whole component of this, you should be maximizing the benefits and minimizing the harms. And that's one of the key principles that we'll see if you're participating in human subject research, especially intervention research. That is an important aspect. And we spend a lot of time looking at those components. Then there's a principle of justice. Equitable distribution of research costs and benefits, fairness in selection of subjects, and benefit is not denied or burden is not imposed. So these are very common ethical issues that have come across time and have now been, in the late 70s, unfortunately, been embraced pretty heavily by the U.S. and the federal government. So what does the federal government do when they want to make sure that something gets done? They pass a regulation. And the regulation that we all work under today is the Common Rule, and it wasn't adopted until 1986. That was proposed and then wasn't codified until 1991. And it was the first time in 25 years that all the regulations were brought under one regulatory framework and overseeing research. And again, this is important, overseeing research that is either conducted by the federal government or in facilities receiving federal funds. Common Rule importantly mandates the role of the IRB. It defines the requirements for informed consent, and it codifies special requirements for vulnerable populations. And you'll see pregnant women here, prisoners here, children here, but you won't see special considerations for the cognitively impaired. And it puts on the institution that's conducting the research that receives the federal funds that they must have an assurance of compliance, that they have an IRB, they've got policies and procedures, and that they are able to effectively oversee the human subjects research. And I remember being a graduate student at University of Texas Health Science Center in Dallas in early 70s and participating in research, and I don't think I signed any informed consent. So it's unfortunately a very, it really isn't that long ago that the concerns really made it into practice and protection of human subjects. And so now, with that as a basis, Janine will discuss what activities are really human subject research, what are the gray areas, and how do we define that, and how do we address issues that come up in carrying it out.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duncan. Thank you all for inviting us today. So I want to change just a little bit after that wonderful introduction of ethics and regulations governing research, and move forward to talking about when these rules apply. So it sounds like it's a pretty simple determination when a project meets the definition of human subject research, but it turns out it's a very complex determination. So we have DHHS, or Office of Human Research Protections, that gives a definition of research. It says a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. One of the problems with that definition is that the regulations do not define some of the key words, such as systematic or generalizable. So it's left up to each individual institution to guess what OHRP means by those words and to apply those consistently within the context of their own institution. As far as human subject, DHH regulations define that as a living individual about whom an investigator obtains data through interaction or intervention or manipulation of their environment, or an investigator obtains identifiable private information. And those two words are very important, and there are some specific definitions of identifiable or private. We actually function under two sets of regulations. In addition to the DHHS regulations, we have FDA rules. Now, a research project can be subject to FDA in one of three situations. One is if the project involves a drug other than in the course of medical practice. The second is if it involves a medical device, when that device is being evaluated for safety or effectiveness. And the third way is if it involves data that will be submitted to the FDA. So the FDA regulates a lot of articles, all the way from baby formula, contact lens, etc. So if there's data that's going to be submitted to the FDA regarding one of those products, it would be subject to FDA purview. Medical devices cover a large ground. Interesting that even a tongue depressor is labeled a medical device according to the FDA. So why do I point that out? Well, there are some important differences. And as a researcher, you need to know which set of rules you're working under. The definitions for research and human subject are different. With regard to categories of research that may be exempt from the regulations, exempt from the common rule, the FDA has far limited exempt category. The DHHS rules allow for more categories of exemption. For example, if you're working with research with children, with minors, the FDA does not allow a waiver of parental permission. So important to know if your research is subject to FDA rules. Another difference is that under FDA rules, participants have to date the consent forms. But DHHS does not have an explicit requirement. The institution may, but DHHS does not regulate that. So when you submit a new protocol submission to the IRB, one of the first things the IRB is going to do is look at it and say, does it belong here? Does it meet the definition of human subject research? And if it does, which set of rules are we following? But it's important for you to know that even before you submit, so that as you plan your research, you can plan it to be compliant with the regulations. I mentioned that there are different definitions of research and human subject according to FDA versus OHRP. This is the FDA definition of research. It's kind of wordy, but the basic premise is an experiment that involves a test article and one or more people. And human subject is defined by FDA as someone who is or becomes a participant in research, with pointing out that it may be a recipient of a test article or of the placebo. So if you are going to do a project and you're not sure whether it has to follow the common rule, whether it has to have IRB approval, we have designed a process so that you can ask that question and obtain an answer. So here at ETSU, that authority to make that decision has been delegated to the IRBs, and the IRBs have delegated the decision to the chair or vice chair. We have Dr. Youngberg here. He's the chair of the medical IRB, and so he is the one that ultimately makes a decision as to whether a proposed project meets the regulatory definition of human subject research under DHHS or FDA. So the IRB is the only one here at the university that has the authority to make that final decision. So we tell you in our policy that unless you're familiar enough with all these regulations, then we want you to bring it to the IRB for that decision. And I wanted to show you the way that you do that. We have recently revamped our website. And so we have a page here, Get Started. Does my project need IRB approval? So if you're going to do a project and you're unsure, you simply go to the web page. Here's a link to a form. It's a very brief 2-page form that you fill out and tell us about your project. And you'll see questions on there that parallel those definitions. We're going to ask you if the data that you're going to access will be private and identifiable. We're going to ask you if you have an intent to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. We're going to ask if your project will be systematic, etc. And when you submit that to the IRB, within a week or so, you will get back a written letter that either says, yes, your project meets the definition of human subject research and you need to submit to the IRB and get approval, or no, it does not meet the regulatory definition of DHHS or FDA for human subject research. And that will be important for you to have if you later finish that project and submit to a journal, and the journal asks for information about IRB review. You're going to need either IRB approval or a determination from the IRB that that was not required. So now I'd like to move on, and we'll do a few case studies and let you look at these different ones and kind of evaluate whether you think it would be regulated under FDA or not. Again, the IRB here will make the final determination, but it's important for you to think about these different instances so that as you're designing projects, you know the appropriate set of rules. So the first one is you want to study a new application that enables a smartphone to perform an EEG during sleep and use this information for diagnostic purposes. And the question is this FDA regulated research? One of the issues that we have is Dr. Duncan pointed out the common rules from 1991, and obviously technology has far outstripped the regulations from 1991. So we have to rely on guidance documents or our best interpretation of or assessment to know when these rules apply. So if you have your clickers, you can vote. Yes, you think this is FDA regulated research, or no, you don't think it's FDA regulated research. Okay, so it looks like about 3/4 say yes, and that is correct. The FDA has provided a guidance document and indicated that they're going to take a tailored, risk-based approach to mobile applications. And so in this case, this type of application that is intended to be an accessory to a medical device and that transforms a smartphone into a regulated medical device means that the project would be subject to the FDA. All right, what about this one? Slightly different. You want to study a mobile app that helps patients with anxiety maintain their behavioral coping skills, and it will provide them a skill of the day, technique, or audio message that they can access when they experience increased anxiety. Is this one FDA regulated research? Wow, you guys are good. So this one is actually a little tricky. What the FDA has said is that technically it is a medical device, but they are going to exercise enforcement discretion, and at this point don't plan to enforce oversight of these type of devices or these type of applications that would just deliver this type of message. So you guys are good at that. So it's a little gray area since they've said technically it's a medical device, but we're going to exercise enforcement discretion. All right, this next one changes it up just a little bit from a consideration of whether it's FDA or not to whether these activities meet the definition of human subject research. So in this particular scenario, your colleague has a repository of identifiable information from patients that's maintained solely for clinical reasons. So you want to be able to use some of the data from that repository to analyze it and present your findings at a conference. So your plan is to access the data so you would see identifiable information, but to record it without the identifiers. The first question is, your colleague with the repository of identifiable information maintained solely for clinical reasons, does your colleague require IRB approval for that repository? IRB approval. Would creating and maintaining a repository of identifiable information for clinical reasons only meet the definition of human subject research and require IRB approval? Okay, so this is a tricky one, and Dr. Youngberg and I talked about this scenario yesterday. So it's a little bit more gray with a colleague who has a database of identifiable information for clinical reasons only. It's a little easier to see if you consider, for example, a cancer registry or an EHR. Technically, an EHR would be a repository of identifiable information for clinical reasons, but it's not intended for research reasons. So in this particular case, to create and maintain a repository of information for clinical reasons only would likely not meet the definition of human subject research. So that said, we would encourage people to ask questions if they have that by submitting 129 if they need a ruling about whether it would or would not be human subject research. Yes? Okay, so there are really two questions embedded there. One is this research? And two, does it involve human subjects or people? So the first, with regard to research, under DHHS was systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. So one of the key questions would be, is there an intent to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge, or is it solely intended to improve the clinical practice in that one institution? Then if you met the definition of research, assuming you had an intent to contribute to or develop generalizable knowledge, the second question would be, does it involve people? If there's no interaction with people, no communication or intervention with them, then it spends on whether the data that you would obtain would be identifiable. It certainly would be private because a person's medical record is private. The question would become, is it identifiable? And issues related to that would be, is that a computer function that a question can be asked and it spits out data that has no identifiers? Or is it that you would get a report that has identifiers that you maybe intended to strip the identifiers? So if you would be obtaining the data in such a way that it was identifiable, that is, that you could associate the data with a person, then it would meet the definition of involving people. Dr. Youngberg, you want to add to that? So there would be, my suggestion, if there's a question, would be to submit the Form 129, and you would clearly say on that form whether you have an intent to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge, and whether the data that would be accessed would be identifiable. Yes, and so we do have in policy 5, we've written a definition about generalizable, and part of that is an intent to take it beyond an internal program. We've defined generalizable typically means that results or conclusions of the activity are intended to be extended beyond a single person or an internal program. And it is very difficult sometimes to pin down what is a desire to contribute or develop generalizable knowledge. QI projects, such as the one you're referencing, are very difficult to apply that definition to. They don't fit the IRB framework, but sometimes they are research. And so that's a struggle, and we're looking forward to hopefully better guidance in the future in terms of when QI projects morph into research or when they're both from the very beginning. Dr. Youngberg, do you want to add anything else to that?
I think we're thinking a pretty standard view that the VA, ETSU, MSHA, and all its components, and now probably DOMA, are one institution for this IRB. So it's true that if you're going to make presentations of results at DOMA, that MSHA, that was ETSU classroom or Department of Medicine meetings, that's all not generalizable from the Tuskegee workings. Generally, for me, publication makes it generalizable. Yeah, or conference presentation at an outside conference. And, the OHRP has said, well, just because something's published doesn't automatically make it generalizable. But every example that Janine and I can find of other IRBs making that determination, publication is one of the key aspects. And at least the way I currently view it, if you want to publish something, why would you want to publish it unless you thought other people could benefit from the knowledge or concepts that you developed? So if you did all that as a QI project, something that involved, could be research, but it was done for QI along this whole massive system, and you just kept it within the system to improve the way things work, or for educational purposes in the classroom or the residency, that I would determine is not generalizable. But if you want to publish it in one of your peer-reviewed professional journals, then it becomes generalizable.
So if the hospital takes that same information and, in a sense, publishes it as part of self-promoting marketing, we've done this QI study of our cardiovascular outcomes, and we're better than everybody.
Yeah.
Does that count as publication?
So that's a good example of how complicated simple things can get. That's my life now. Every week, I'm pulling my hair out because sometimes the devil's in the detail, and there are gray areas where I have to make a decision because it has to go one way or another. If it was a very general statement, I'd probably say it wasn't making it generalizable, but if they were presenting more specific aspects of what turned up, then it might be. Also, one thing I just thought I'd mention, because it causes a lot of trouble, is our excellent Appalachian Regional Research Conference. Even though we hold it here, that's something that we have considered. If it's presented there, it's generalizable, because that is a regional conference, and it's actually in the name of the conference. So people should get those research things ironed out ahead of time if they want to use something for the Appalachian conference. I don't know, are you going to talk about the whole business with QI versus research?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Future.
just make one other quick thing. One of the worst problems we're having now is dealing with things that are QI functions, but may also be research. So things can be both. If you're doing QI and it's not generalizable, then it's not research. But if you're doing a QI project and you want to publish it, you know in advance you want to publish it, it may well be research. And sometimes that becomes difficult. So there are situations where the primary intent is to do QI, and there's a chance that maybe something interesting would turn up or unusual that might be publishable, but you're really doing it primarily as QI. In that setting, I think perhaps the best approach is to do it for QI if it's a legitimate, I don't mean like a student-initiated QI project, which is really their student research, but something that's really being driven by a need in the clinic or the hospital or something like that. Do the QI project as a QI project, and maybe there won't be anything to publish, but if there is, then you can come back to the IRB and ask for permission to use existing data to publish as research, because it turned out to be of interest to other people. So you can do some of that. I think I would have a little problem if somebody did QI study after QI study, and every time they wound up wanting to publish it. But in general, a lot of what we've gotten as QI, where it would be hard to do if it was research, is really primarily QI, and we've done it that way. So that's one approach, and we can work with you about that if that comes up. And just one last quick comment about the de-identifying of the data. So some things where people are doing research, they want to access charts, and that turns the patients into participants. Then you have the issue of getting informed consent or justifying a waiver. That can really be problematic. It's doable, but it's difficult. But sometimes, if it's just specific data, the research group can get that as de-identified data, but someone has to access the identified data. So we've been allowing, if let's say in a psychiatry clinic, that someone that works with the data, like a secretary or something like that, who has nothing to do with the research project, could go in the medical records, extract the data points, de-identify or aggregate them, give them to the research group, and then that would be research using de-identifiable data. And if that was all you were doing, then it wouldn't even be IRB research. So there's a lot of tricky situations, and there's some pathways sometimes to make things easier. So if you're dealing with something like that, please contact Janine, myself, and Dr. Duncan, and we'll try and work with you to get the best way to make the thing move forward effectively.
Thank you. Those are great questions. Okay, so this first question was about the creation and maintenance of a repository for clinical reasons. The second question is about you as a researcher. If you want to get identifiable information from that repository and use it for a research project, do you need IRB approval? Go ahead and speed us up a little bit because we're running out of time. Oh. Okay, so correct, you absolutely need IRB approval. So any access of private identifiable data for research purposes requires IRB approval. All right, next scenario. You want to create a database of information about all your patients with a diagnosis of depression, and you want to use this for two reasons, clinical and research. Do you need IRB approval to create and maintain that repository? Yes or no? Okay. Yes, you do need IRB approval to create and maintain that repository because it's for research purposes and it contains identifiable data. Okay, next question. Does each access or use of identifiable data for research require IRB approval? In other words, you have this database that you have approval for. Each time you go in there with a research question, does that require IRB approval?
I want to clarify.
Yes.
So with this database, then if they presented the IRB approval for one question, saying I want to investigate this, and then they say, oh, well, you know what? Maybe I want to go check another completely different question.
Yes. The answer is yes. So unless you've written your first application to create and maintain it broadly enough that it covers all those activities, which is unlikely, then each time that there was another fishing expedition into that database, it would require IRB approval. Okay, I think this is the last one. Well, maybe there's two more. You have a student who wants to do a retrospective review of the medical record of 3 patients. So 3 case studies with the intent to report and or publish the summary. So there's an intent to develop or contribute generalizable knowledge. How would you advise the student? Tell the student to go ahead and do it. Tell the student to submit Form 129, asking the IRB whether approval is needed, or tell the student to go ahead and just submit a new protocol submission to the IRB. Correct answer is B. For a case study with 3 people, we would expect the student to submit a 129 to the IRB to get a determination. Actually, in our Policy 5, we have some really good guidance about case studies. And so that's posted on our website. So if you have questions about that, there's detailed information there. All right. Just a couple last slides to let you know that in addition to these 2 sets of regulations that we've been discussing, DHHS and FDA, there are a lot of other rules or regulations that apply to human subject research. We do sometimes feel at ETSU like we're in the hot seat at the IRB. We have a lot of oversight organizations, including accrediting bodies as well as Tennessee state law, VA organizations, etc., who all can come and audit us and who oversee the research. So this is the last case study, and this is saying the psychiatry department decides to implement a new curriculum for students, and you want to evaluate the effectiveness. So to do that, you're going to need the grades of individual students before and after the change. Do you need IRB approval? Yes, no, or it depends. If you say it depends, you need to tell us verbally why, what it depends on.
Depends on what the IRB says.
Depends on what the IRB says. Great answer. An opportunity. It depends. So there's nothing in this scenario that told us whether there was an intent to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. So it's not clear whether the intent of the evaluation of the curriculum is just intended to be used internally in the program, or whether there's also a desire to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. If that is true, then it would meet the definition of human subject research. So this would be an instance where you'd probably want to submit a 129, because it does depend on the intent, what you want to do with the data. So last question, does FERPA, Family Educational Rights Protection Act, have an impact on your project? These are student grades before and after. So do you have to consider what FERPA says before you do this project? Go ahead and put it up. Absolutely, yes. So you do, because student records are regulated by FERPA. So if you're proposing to the IRB that you access identifiable student grades without their consent, then you would need your department chair to tell the IRB how that meets an exception under FERPA that would allow that access. I think our time is about up, and I want to thank you all. We'll stay here for a few minutes if you have specific questions and you're planning to do further presentations to address some more detailed issues. Yes?
I have two that kind of stretch the boundaries of this. First one involves research with forensic populations. Suppose you have pre-trial detainees who've been found incompetent to stand trial because they suffer from a delusional disorder. Delusions are notoriously hard to treat. The court orders that they be treated involuntarily and gives permission for use of an experimental drug. Does the court order trump the IRB?
Okay, so did you think that one up before you came?
No, I just thought, yeah. It's actually an important area of research.
Okay, so they would be considered prisoners under IRB regulations because they're involuntarily detained. So you're saying the court order says that they have to have this drug?
Court orders that they can be involuntarily treated, and the court order specifies that they can be given an experimental drug.
Well,
Or given a drug in an experimental way.
I think a drug given in the course of medical practice is different than a drug given for research purposes. So that would depend on whether that medication is being given in the course of medical practice versus for research.
Okay?
Yeah.
Second question,
Yes, Dr. Duncan.
which asks about a different kind of boundary. Let's say that the psychiatry department had some concerns about the way in which patients' rights were being respected when they are involuntarily committed at Woodridge. Now, if we wanted to do that research and go into Woodridge, I understand the IRB would apply. What if somebody from the journalism department, acting as an investigative journalist, stood outside the front door of Woodridge and buttonholed patients as they were leaving and said, did you have X, Y, or Z experience while you were in the hospital? Would you give me permission to use your medical records in writing up a story for publication? Could I use your name? Is that something the IRB regulates? Does the in other words, how do you balance the First Amendment issues with somebody who's functioning as a journalist when arguably they're doing the same thing that a researcher might do when they're not functioning as a journalist?
So part of the answer to that is that ETSU has what's called an FWA, a federal-wide assurance with the government, that says any human subject research at ETSU will undergo IRB review and approval and will meet the regulations. So if an activity meets the definition of human subject research according to DHHS or FDA, and it's being conducted by an ETSU faculty, staff, or student in connection with their institutional responsibilities, it is subject to the purview of the IRB. So the answer would depend on whether it met the definition of research, meaning whether the information that they would obtain would be designed to contribute to general knowledge.
Let's assume that what the investigative journalist is doing would meet the definition of research, but they're saying this is journalism and it's covered by the First Amendment and you can't intervene.
Or you just mean asking them to come out? Is that the question?
So that would be in Dr. Duncan's purview.
Are you asking the question that someone's coming out of a clinic and the patient self-identifies as I've been in a research study?
No, the journalist is standing out there and says, were you just a patient? And if the person says yes, would you be willing to talk to me? Could I have access to your medical records? I'm concerned about, learning about the experiences of people who've been committed and writing about it.
I think, that's a tough question, but I would think if we don't, the university could not provide that information to anyone outside. That's confidential. But if someone sees patients coming out of the clinic and asks them the question, are you in a research study? I don't think we have any.
Well, I think he was saying an ETSU person in the journalism department, not a Johnson City Press person.
Right,
Because
correct.
Johnson City Press doesn't have an FWA with the government.
I would say, you still conduct every part. If you're a UNTS employee, you're going to, if it's a study, it would be different if it's a journalist who's not associated with the university. But if it's ETSU and it's part of the work, we have to look at that. Is that part of your job responsibilities at ETSU? Then that would think would fall in.
And it may or may not be generalizable.
Yeah.
I mean, a
Right.
person's experience
This
at an
question is
institution.
not unique to me. It was actually raised to me by a professor of journalism from Middle Tennessee State, who is also a lawyer, and who's having some dispute with his institution about whether the journalism things that his students do are subject to the IRB or not. And I didn't know if you guys had any perspective on that, or whether that's
We've
an issue.
seen that. My concern would be the privacy of the individual, and especially if an individual who's participating in a study, they may not want anyone to know they've been through a mental health clinic. There are a lot of issues there that I think go beyond IRB. They go into protection of privacy of the subject. We've never seen anything. Have you seen?
We have had questions regarding oral history. It's a little bit different, but in terms of whether that meets the definition of generalizable or not. The framework that we have to work within is, does it meet the definition of human subject research? So all these other factors are important, and I agree, especially like you're bringing up First Amendment rights, et cetera. But we're kind of stuck in this framework of if it meets the definition and it's being done by an ETSU person in connection with their institutional responsibilities, then
But
that's the
doesn't it also
framework.
end up being the public? One is going to be the patient's given permission because they're standing outside and saying the journalist is asking, can I get your information? So they're giving over permission at that point by actually answering the questions and being informed about it. The second issue becomes, where is it being published? If it's going into a newspaper, is that considered the same as typically when you're talking about generalizability, we're talking about presentation at a conference and publication. So how will the newspaper
If
come out?
it gets in a newspaper today, it can be picked up anywhere and be all over the world.
Right.
So I would consider that a generalizable, not that it's generalizable knowledge, generalizable distribution of knowledge. And so, not that people go to the, well, one of the issues we've talked about in the regulations that I dealt with is when you get the use of social media, and it drives us crazy. What are the protections of social media? And there's really not a lot of case law and case studies in this arena right now. Google can do anything they want to do. They're not receiving federal funds for research. We are, so we can't do the kind of things Google does and tricking you into doing certain things.
So Dr. Duncan referenced the advance notice of proposed rulemaking for 2013. One of the suggestions in that was that they clearly define what things are exempt from IRB oversight. Like it clearly define this type of QI doesn't go here, journalism doesn't go here, et cetera. And we want them to do that.
Yeah.
We want them to be really clear so that the best answers are consistently applied across the board. But those are really tough questions, and I think that would spin on whether that's generalizable. I think it's different talking to one person or even several people about their experience at a single institution versus do you have an intent to take that and apply it across the board at other similar institutions. Yes.
Before we finish, I'd like to say to the audience that for 10 years I've presented IRB with repeated and quite complicated studies and sometimes novel studies that you haven't dealt with before. And I have to say that Dr. Youngberg, Janine, her husband, before him as the chair, Dr. Duncan, and all of your staff, you have never, ever been unhelpful or difficult to work with. It's a pleasure to work with you all, and I see you as colleagues who can help me out. And I may be going down the wrong path, and you'll guide me into doing something maybe a little differently. And I think everybody who doesn't do research needs to know that approaching you all will have a very good outcome. It's a very nice collegial relationship.
Thank you. We appreciate those kind words. And do, if you have questions, we welcome sitting down and talking to you.
And I think that's a key thing. Thanks, Dr. Moore. I mean, we're here to help you. We're here to protect you. We're doing two things: protecting subjects, protecting you as an investigator, protecting the university. And it's our job to find a way for you to do the study you want to do. Asking us up front, we'll sit down with you and help you address the questions. Sometimes we do it one way that's going to create more barriers for you. Another way might make it easier. So we have quite a few meetings with faculty and students to address their issues and concerns.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to add one brief comment to Norman's, which is that in terms of the decision of when you're doing research, I think it's particularly important to point out that that's the time to consult with the IRB. And decisions that are made hastily by investigators who think that they know the answer and then try to get the feedback afterward are unfortunately ones that are going to be having consequences that we don't want to have the risk for if possible. So the really important take-home message for me of the presentation today by the IRB is to really be thinking about when you might be potentially doing research, and if you're not sure, get feedback.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job. That was really great. I really
thank you.
enjoyed it. That was very
Good.
insightful. It's nice to meet you.
We tried to do a few engaged things.
Yeah, that's great. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
I don't know about that.